On the 9th of April, 1998, a records clerk in a small county office in South Florida typed a short entry into a logbook that had run without interruption for nearly 2 decades, and then, without any memo, any announcement, or any explanation anyone has ever been able to produce, that logbook simply stopped. The entry itself was unremarkable by the standards of everything that had come before it. A caller, identified only by initials per the office's standard practice, reported an animal sighting along a canal levee road near the edge of the Big Cypress Basin, tall, dark-haired, bipedal, moving away from the caller's headlights into dense palmetto scrub before vanishing from view. It was, in almost every detail, a routine entry, one of hundreds like it that had been logged in that same book since 1979. It was also the last one. This is the story of the Collier County Nuisance Wildlife Log, an informal but consistently maintained record of animal sighting calls, including a specific, recurring category for unidentified bipedal sightings that locals had called the skunk ape for generations, and why. After nearly 20 years of steady entries, the county simply stopped logging them, with no public explanation ever given for why April of 1998 was where the record ended. To understand why that ending matters, you need to understand what the log actually was, because it wasn't some fringe cryptid tracking operation run by enthusiasts. It began, according to former county employees who worked in the office during its early years, as a fairly mundane piece of local bureaucracy, a general nuisance animal call log. The kind of record almost any rural county maintains, originally intended to track complaints about alligators near residential canals, black bears getting into garbage, and the occasional loose livestock report, sometime in the late 1970s. According to those same former employees, callers reporting the more unusual sightings, descriptions matching what locals already called the skunk ape, a bipedal, foul-smelling creature with a long folklore history throughout the Big Cypress and Everglades region, began being logged in the same book, under the same general nuisance call category, simply because there wasn't anywhere else in the system to put them. No one made a formal decision to start tracking cryptid sightings. It happened almost by administrative accident, folded into an existing process that already existed for entirely different reasons. Once the pattern was established, though, it continued with surprising consistency. Former clerks described the log receiving, on average, somewhere between 4 and 10 such calls per year throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, not an overwhelming number, but a remarkably steady one, logged with the same procedural neutrality as any other nuisance complaint: date, approximate location, brief description, caller initials, and a checkbox indicating whether any follow-up action was taken, which for these particular entries was almost always left unmarked. The entries themselves, when described by people who've seen portions of the log before it became difficult to access, painted a fairly consistent picture across nearly 2 decades. Reports clustered heavily around canal levee roads and the fringes of Big Cypress National Preserve, areas where dense palmetto and cypress cover meets more open agricultural or residential land, the kind of edge habitat where an unusual animal, if one existed in that region, would be most likely to be glimpsed briefly by people in cars or on foot near the tree line, rather than deep in terrain few residents ever entered. A handful of individual entries stood out enough that former employees still remember them decades later, even without direct access to the original documents. One, from the early 1980s, reportedly described 2 independent callers phoning in within the same hour, describing what sounded like the same animal at 2 different points along the same several-mile stretch of Levee Road, an early, informal echo of the kind of multi-witness convergence that would later define stories like the Ohio Bridge sightings, though in this case never formally cross-referenced or treated as connected within the log itself. Another entry, from 1991, described a caller who reported not a sighting but an extended encounter with an overwhelming, specific odor near a canal crossing, sulfurous, animal, distinct from swamp gas or decomposition according to the caller's own comparison, accompanied by heavy movement in nearby brush that the caller did not directly see but described hearing clearly for several minutes before it faded into the distance. The clerk who logged that entry apparently noted, informally, that it was one of the more detailed odor descriptions in the log's history, though the note itself was reportedly personal rather than official, scrawled in margin space rather than the standard entry fields. By the mid-1990s, according to former staff, the log had become enough of a known quantity within the office that new employees were sometimes informally told about it during onboarding, treated less as a serious wildlife management tool and more as a piece of local institutional trivia. The sort of thing a supervisor might mention with a slight smile. More curiosity than concern. No one interviewed for accounts of this period describes any sense, at the time, that the log itself was controversial or that its existence created any particular friction within the county government. Which is part of what makes April of 1998 so difficult to explain. There was no public announcement that the county would stop logging unidentified bipedal sighting calls. There was no policy memo circulated that any former employee has been able to produce or specifically recall. As far as anyone who worked in that office during the transition has been able to describe. The practice simply ended. The April 9th entry was followed by nothing. Not because sightings stopped being called in, but because, according to at least two former clerks interviewed separately over the years by local researchers, callers describing skunk ape sightings after that date were redirected, informally, to general information lines or told the county no longer tracked that specific category of report, without any documented policy change ever being cited to justify the shift. One former clerk, who worked in the office both before and after the transition and who has asked not to be identified by name in any public account, has described being told directly by a supervisor, sometime in mid-1998, that unidentified animal calls should no longer be logged in the Nuisance wildlife book specifically, and should instead simply be noted as general wildlife inquiry, no action, if documented at all, an instruction that, by this clerk's account, was delivered verbally, informally, with no accompanying written directive, and that the supervisor gave no specific reasoning for beyond a general comment about the log not really serving its intended purpose anymore. That explanation, on its face, is plausible enough. Local government offices reorganize administrative practices constantly, often for reasons as mundane as a new supervisor preferring a cleaner record-keeping system, a state auditor flagging inconsistent logging categories, or simply a general housekeeping effort to streamline an old paper process ahead of a records digitization push that many county offices undertook around that same period in the late 1990s. None of that requires any deliberate intent to suppress or hide anything. But several details complicate that simple explanation, at least enough that local researchers who've tried to piece together the story over the years have never fully accepted it at face value. First, no other category within the same general nuisance log was discontinued at the same time: alligator complaints, bear sightings, and loose livestock reports all continued being logged in the identical format, in the identical book, well past 1998, based on records that have remained more accessible in the years since. Only the unidentified bipedal sighting category stopped, specifically and exclusively, at that point. Second, when a local newspaper reporter working on an unrelated feature about county wildlife management requested access to nuisance animal records in the early 2000s, seeking a general overview for a story about human-wildlife conflict trends in the area, she was reportedly told that older logs from that specific period were not readily available due to a records transition, without further specifics offered about what that transition entailed or when the records might become accessible again. She did not pursue the request further at the time, as it fell outside the scope of the story she was actually working on. And by her own later account, she didn't think much more about the specific gap until years afterward, when the broader story of the discontinued log began circulating more widely among regional cryptid researchers. A more formal public records request, filed considerably later by an independent researcher specifically seeking historical entries related to unidentified animal sightings, received a response stating that no responsive records could be located for the requested time period, a common enough outcome for older paper records that may have been lost, damaged, or simply not properly transferred during a records digitization effort, but one that, combined with everything else, has done little to settle the question for people who've followed the story closely. Skeptics of any suppression narrative point out, reasonably, that government records get lost or improperly archived constantly, entirely independent of their content. Paper logs from small county offices in the 1980s and 90s were often kept inconsistently even under normal circumstances. And the sheer administrative churn of records digitization efforts throughout that era genuinely did result in significant, well-documented gaps across countless unrelated municipal record categories nationwide. Nothing about a specific gap, even a suspicious-looking one, necessarily implies deliberate action rather than ordinary bureaucratic entropy. They also point out that discontinuing an informal, non-standardized log category makes practical administrative sense independent of the log's specific subject matter. Unidentified bipedal sighting calls, whatever their underlying cause, don't map cleanly onto any actionable wildlife management category the way alligator or bear complaints do. There's no established protocol for responding to them, no clear jurisdictional owner for handling them, and from a pure administrative efficiency standpoint, a category that generates paperwork without generating any actionable follow-up is exactly the kind of thing an office reorganization would plausibly eliminate first, entirely apart from any questions about what was actually being reported. Those who take the story more seriously push back somewhat, though carefully, without claiming to know exactly what happened. They point to the specificity of the cutoff, a single category discontinued at a precise, identifiable point, rather than a gradual tapering or a general records gap affecting multiple categories evenly, as at least mildly suggestive of a targeted decision rather than pure administrative accident. Even if the underlying motivation for that targeted decision remains entirely unclear and could still plausibly be as simple as one supervisor's personal discomfort with the category rather than anything more coordinated. They also point out that the specific redirection described by the former clerk, actively telling callers the county no longer tracked that category, rather than simply discontinuing the paperwork silently, implies at least some conscious decision-making process happened somewhere in the office in mid-1998, even if that decision was made by a single mid-level supervisor for entirely mundane, non-conspiratorial reasons rather than anything approaching a coordinated cover-up. What's clear, regardless of which explanation is correct, is that the sightings themselves didn't stop in 1998. Local researchers who've maintained informal, independent tracking of skunk ape reports throughout the region in the years since describe a steady, if scattered, continuation of similar accounts. Hikers, hunters, and residents near the same general canal and preserve edge areas continuing to report very similar encounters, just with nowhere official left to log them, and with no consistent central record maintained anywhere in the years since the county log went quiet. The former clerk who described the 1998 instructions still lives in the area and has said, in the handful of conversations she's had about it over the years, that she genuinely doesn't believe anything sinister happened, that in her read of her supervisor at the time, it was almost certainly a case of someone simply not wanting to be responsible for a records category that, in his words to her, made the county look a little silly, during a period when the office was already under pressure to modernize and streamline its recordkeeping ahead of a broader digitization push. But she's also said, more than once, that she still finds it strange that a category maintained with that much procedural consistency for nearly 2 decades, logged with the same neutral, dispassionate language as every alligator complaint and loose livestock call that came before and after it, could simply stop. specifically and only for that one category, without a single piece of paper anywhere in the county system explaining exactly why. The Big Cypress Basin and the preserved land bordering it remain, today, largely what they were in 1998, vast, sparsely populated, dense with palmetto and cypress cover, genuinely difficult terrain for any systematic wildlife survey to fully cover even now. Reports continue to surface informally, through regional cryptid research networks rather than any official county channel, describing largely the same pattern the old log once captured. Sightings clustered along the same general edge habitat. The same canal levee roads. The same brief, startled encounters that generated 4 to 10 calls a year for nearly 20 years before an office in South Florida quietly decided, for reasons no document has ever fully explained, that April of 1998 would be where the official record simply stopped.